Okay, so welcome back to Hebrew Story Hour. Today our story, I have a couple of stories in a way. We're kind of wrapping up the Jacob story, although I think an argument can be made that the Jacob story goes all the way to the end of Genesis until the blessing of the sons and so on. But certainly this is after this, chapter 36 is where we would start transitioning anyway into the Joseph narratives. So Genesis 35. Lord bless the reading of his word. Vayomer Elohim el Yaakov, kum ele veit el, v'shev sham, v'aseh sham mizbeach, la'el hanir'eh elecha, v'vorchecha mipnei esav achicha. Verse 2, Vayomer Yaakov el beito, Ve'el kol asher imo, hasiru et Elohei hanechar asher betochechem, v'hitaharu, v'hachalifu, simlotechem. Verse 3, V'nakuma v'na'ale beit el, ve'eseh sham, Mizbeach la'el han oneh oti b'yom tzarati, va'yehi imadi, ba'derech asher halachti. Verse 4, Vayitanu el Yaakov et kol Elohei hanechar asher b'yadam, ve'et hanzamim asher be'oznehem, ve'yitmon otam Yaakov tachat ha'elah, asher im Shechem. Okay, stop there and go back to verse 1 for translation. God said to Jacob, get up and go up, or rise and go up to Bethel. Stay there and make an altar there for El, who appeared to you. So for God, the one who appeared to you when you fled away from Esau, your brother. And Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, remove the foreign gods who are in your midst, and purify yourselves and change your clothes, and let us arise and go up to Bethel, and let us make there, and I will make an altar there for the God who answered me in the day of my distress, and he was with me on the way that I went. And they gave to Jacob all the gods, all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and the earrings which were in their ears. And he hid them, or Jacob hid them under the terebinth or some kind of tree, which was in Shechem. Verse 5. Vayisa'u vayihi chitat Elohim al heharim asher sivotehem below radafu acharei b'nei Yaakov. Vayavo Yaakov luza asher be'eretz Canaan hi beit el hu v'chol ha'am asher imo. Verse 7, Vayivin sham mizbeach, vayikra lamakom el betel, ki sham niglu elav ha Elohim, bevorcho bipnei achiv. Verse 8, Batamot Devorah, Meneket Rivka, Batikaver Mitachat Levet El, Tachat Ha-Alon, Vayikra Shemo Alon Bakut. Okay, we're going to translate now, verse 5. And they journeyed, and the fear or the dread of God was upon the cities that surrounded them. And they did not pursue after them, or after the sons of Jacob. And Jacob went to Luz, which was in the land of Canaan. It was Bethel. And he and all the people who were with him. And he built an altar there, and he called the place El Bethel, or you could say God of Bethel. For there, God was revealed to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah died, the nurse of Rivka, and she was buried under, or maybe beside Bethel, under the oak, the Alon. And he called the name of the oak Bachut, which is weeping. Verse 9. Vayera Elohim El Yaakov od, bevo'o mipadan aram, vayevarech oto. Verse 10. Vayomer lo Elohim Shimcha Yaakov, lo yekare Shimcha od Yaakov, ki im Yisrael, yehyeh shemecha, vayikra et shemo Yisrael. 11. Vayomer lo Elohim, ani el Shaddai, hare ureve goy kahal goyim, yehyeh memeka, umalachim me chalatzecha yetzeu, ve'et haaretz asher natati la'Avraham u'leYitzchak lecha etenena, u'lezarecha acharecha etain et haaretz. 13. Vaya'al me'alav Elohim b'makom asher diber ito. 14. Vayatsev Yaakov matseva b'makom asher diber ito. Matsevet aven vayasech alecha nesach vayitzok aleha shaman. Verse 15. Vayikra Yaakov et Shem hamakom asher diber ito sham Elohim Beit El. Okay, going back to verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and he blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. You will no longer, or you will not be called your name will no longer be called Jacob, but rather Israel. Your name shall be." And he named him Israel. And God said to him, "I am El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a cohort of nations will come from you, and kings from your loins will come out. Kings will come out from your loins." Verse 12. And the land which I gave to Abraham and Yitzchak, I will give to you, and to your seed after you, I will give the land. And he went up from upon him. God went up from him in the place where he spoke with him. And Jacob stood up a pillar or a standing stone in the place where he spoke with him, a standing stone or a pillar of stone. And he poured out upon it a drink offering, and he poured out upon it oil. And Jacob named the place, named the name of the place where he spoke with him there, or where God spoke with him there, Bethel. Okay, verse 16. Vayis'u mebeit el, vayihi od, kivrat haaretz, lavo Ephrata. Vateled Rachel vatikash belidta. 17. Vayihi bahakshotha belidta. Vatomer la hamayelet. Hamayelet. Al tivri'i ki gamze lachbein. Vayihi b'tzeit nafsha ki meta, vatikra shemo ben oni, va'aviv kara lo Benyamin. 19. Vatamot Rachel, vatikaver b'derek Ephrata, ki beit lachem. Vayatsev Yaakov matzeva, al kivuratha ki matzevet kivurat Rachel ad hayom. Okay, translating with 16. And they journeyed from Bethel, and again, while there was still some land to go to Ephrata, Rachel gave birth, and her labor was difficult. And in the difficulty of her labor, she said to her, or the midwife said to her, "Do not be afraid, for this one also is a son." And when her life was going out, for she was dying, she named him Ben Oni, that is, son of my mourning. But his father named him Binyamin, which is son of my right hand, or the right hand. And Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrata, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob stood up a stone, or a pillar, on her grave, or maybe beside her tomb. And it was a standing stone of the grave of Rachel until today. It's still there today. Okay, verse 21, then, 21. Vayisa Yisrael, vayetz ocholo, me hala'ah lemigdal eder. 22. Vayehi bishkon Yisrael ba'aretz hahi. Vayelech Reuven vayishkav et bilha pilegish aviv. Vayishma Yisrael. Vayihyu v'nei Yaakov shenem asar. 23. V'nei Leah B'chor Yaakov, Reuven, V'Shimon, V'Levi, V'Yehuda, V'Yishachar, Uzvulun. B'nei Rachel, Yosef, Uvinyamin, V'Uvnei Bilha, Shivcha Rachel, Dan v'Naftali, Uvnei Zilpah, Shivcha Leah, Gad v'Asher. Ele b'nei Yaakov, Asher Yulad Lo, v'Padan Aram. Okay, going translate now 21. And Israel journeyed, and he stretched out his tent in the direction of, or over there near Migdal Eder. That is the tower of a flock, probably, or something like that, but it's a proper name. 22. And Israel settled down in that land. And Reuben went and he laid with Bilhah, the concubine of his father, and Israel heard. And the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah, the sons of Leah were the firstborn of Jacob, Reuben, and Shimon, and Levi, and Yehuda, and Yishachar, and Zivulun. And the sons of Rachel were Yosef and Binyamin. And the sons of Bilhah, the maidservant of Rachel, were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, the maidservant of Leah, were Gad and Asher. These are the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. 27. Vayavo Yaakov el Yitzchak, Aviv, Mamre Kiryat Ha'arba, Hi Chevron, Asher Gar Sham, Avraham v'Yitzchak. 28. Vayihyu Yemei Yitzchak, Ma'at Shana Ushamonim Shana. Vayegva Yitzchak, Vayamot, Vayeyasef El Amav, Zakein Usava Yamim, Vayikbaru Oto Esav, Vayakov Banav. And 27. Jacob went to Isaac, his father, at Mamre, that is Kiryat Ha'arba, that is Hebron, where Avraham sojourned. Avraham and Isaac, Yitzchak, had sojourned. And the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac expired, and he died, and he was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And Esau and Jacob, his sons, buried him. The end. Okay, well, certainly takes us to the end of Isaac's narrative, and it's been a little while since we've seen Isaac, actually. Esau comes back. It's also, this story incorporates the Rachel's death, and so kind of a fitting conclusion in a lot of ways. Of course, the story goes on from here, but any questions or observations to get us started here with chapter 35?
Yes.
John?
Yeah. We kind of assume that these patriarchs, believers in Yahweh, would translate to everyone within their sphere of influence. But here it looks like within Jacob's household, and I assume this is probably his servants and people like that, uh, he didn't seem to exert a lot of influence upon them to give up their foreign gods up until this point.
Yeah, it's maybe a little surprising to us that he has to tell them to, hey, we're going to the Bethel, so you better get rid of your foreign gods that are in their hands. And it's really fascinating what he does with them. But yeah, it's we've seen them before. It reminds me of like when Rachel stole Laban's gods, right? And she kept them secret, kind of buried them in a way. Jacob doesn't like get after her and say, there's, and this actually really reminds me, although there's some distinction clearly of some of the Exodus story. When Exodus 19, when they're getting ready to, they're getting ready to encounter God at Sinai, and they have to change their clothes and bathe and prepare for 3 days because they're going to go meet God. And when I was reading Jacob's instructions, it's a bit different. It's similar, but yeah, you're right. There's it's mixed with obviously getting rid of other gods that are clearly idols or something because they can hold them in their hands. And you have this stuff in here, more stuff about stones and anointing all rocks and things, that would be prohibited once we get to Deuteronomy.
Yeah, but there seems to be a tolerance for it. There seems to be a tolerance for it.
Yeah, right. There is a kind of tolerance, more so for sure here than there will be later on in the life of Israel.
Do you think that it has something to do with being essentially pre-Exodus and 10 Commandments in the Mosaic Law, where they didn't have those things? They didn't know, you shall make no carved images. Like,
yeah,
the Lord God, the living God is the God. I just kind of wonder also, in a sense, how popular was El Shaddai. I don't know exactly how they knew him in Genesis. But did everybody know who he was? Did they know what his rules and expectations were? Because they may not have thought anything of having idols and so forth. I don't know. It's something I've always been curious about.
Yeah, there's definitely, it's fascinating. Like the story doesn't get rewritten in light of later reforms. Like you have Mosaic Torah at Sinai that we hear about, right, in Exodus and Deuteronomy, but a lot of those reforms or Deuteronomy is not really like enforced in a kind of broad way until you get to Hezekiah and certainly Josiah. So people in the 8th century, let's say, or 9th century of Israel's life, I mean, they practiced religious practice. Bethel was a religious site, right? A worship site. And yeah, I think it's important that like, they don't just ditch this story because it reflects sort of prohibited worship practices. On El Shaddai, so this is one of those places where, I've said a few times where you get kind of different threads of stories that are woven together. And we've encountered this before 2 times, El Shaddai, throughout the year that we've been studying Genesis. One I think it's in chapter 17, where it's the Abrahamic promise that involves circumcision, and it's El Shaddai who, I don't know if it's there, I think it's 17. And then El Shaddai always shows up in blessing texts. And it's always the kind of the priestly blessing to be fruitful and multiply, and that nations will come from you. And I don't remember if we've looked at it previously, but in Exodus 6, you get sort of this retrospect in Exodus 6. Just flip over there. I don't remember, we probably mentioned this, I don't know if we've read it. So, right, talking to Moses in Exodus 6, verse 2, God said to Moses, or God spoke to Moses, and he said to him, I am Yahweh, right? So you have the divine name, but I appeared to Abraham and to Yitzchak and Yaakov as El Shaddai. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make known to them, or I did not make myself known to them. So it's like in this thread of the story, God hasn't appeared to them by name yet. They just know him as El Shaddai, sort of this covenantal. El Shaddai is associated with the promise, the God of the promise. That's not what El Shaddai means, but that's kind of the narrative. But then he's revealing more of God's self in Exodus 6, and at least it's kind of this. So El Shaddai is one of those ways to, it's almost like periodization, where you have this time when God appears as El Shaddai, and then kind of a more general name, the God of the promise, the God of the ancestors. And the same God is Yahweh, but now Yahweh is God's real name. So that priestly blessing right there is an important kind of linking point with some of the other previous stories.
Lance, I've got a question on that point that you mentioned there about knowing God by his name.
Yeah.
I think we're all aware that in the history of Judaism, there became a prohibition against saying or like writing down his name in case it could be erased or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But really thinking back to the beginning when he's revealing himself, as Yahweh, I don't know, I guess there's maybe two parts. Do you know of any prohibition in scripture against saying his name, since this is the name he wants to be known by?
Mm-hmm.
And, it's the one thing I really like about the names of God in the Old Testament Hebrew is that there's generally no prepositions. So, when we say the Lord,
Yeah.
it sort of depersonalizes it.
Yeah.
Whereas when he's just known as Yahweh or Adonai or El Shaddai, so I'm really wondering,
Yeah.
from God's point, I guess the bottom line is, from God's point of view, is he fine with us saying his name and rejoicing in that, or does he not want us to say it? Thinking back into context there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that we can speak with authority on the deep desires of God himself, but your question is good. Like there's a long tradition, right, of avoiding saying the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, Yahweh. It's the way it's usually kind of pronounced. I think that's a pretty accurate representation of the way they would have originally spoken it. And I think God does originally speak it in the revelation of, like in Exodus. And Exodus is largely a revelation of what it means for God to be Yahweh. Like really defining that, the God of salvation, the God of deliverance, and God of presence, and all these things. And I assume that the prohibition on speaking the name comes from the commandment: do not lift the name of Yahweh for shava, for nothingness, for usually translated in vain, which I take to be broader than just speaking the name of Yahweh. I think there's like power in a personal name. We don't necessarily use this still, but we get this, like when you sign a signature on something, there's like authority in the writing of a name. There's potential power in speaking a name, right? So you don't want to accidentally say the name of God in an abusive sense, that you could hurt somebody with the name of God, like curse somebody, or you don't want to. So I think probably from that, on that basis, then there's this long tradition of not saying the name. It shows up as early as the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they don't have vowels, right? So the Masoretic text points it with the vowels for Adonai, Lord. But even earlier in the Septuagint translates it as Kurios, Lord. So now we're talking about 2nd century BC. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them anyway, write it with kind of an older script. So as our earliest manuscripts have this tradition of avoiding the divine name. However, I do think that when in the origins of God actually speaking to Israel, they definitely said Yahweh, or something really close to that, the actual name of God. It's just hard to know what happens in between there about, so when does the tradition start? I agree that it kind of is depersonalized. And so in my own practices, I try to actually say Yahweh, even when I'm reading English, so that just because I think it's important to not take it lightly, but to recognize that God is giving this kind of real gift of in revealing the divine name.
It would be very odd for us to not say the name of Jesus, thinking of a parallel, and the power invested in that name is, phenomenal. The meaning of his name, Yeshua, and all of that. I mean, so it'd be very weird for us to say, I respect Jesus so much that I'll never mention his name, whereas 2nd John, they went out for the sake of the name. There's salvation in no other name.
Well, in the Old Testament, people pray in the name of Yahweh toward the temple, like through the temple, kind of to Yahweh. In the name of, in Deuteronomy, the name of God resides sort of in the temple, or it's kind of there at the temple. So I think that's the key thing, is that there's power in the name. So you don't want to use it like an everyday speech. There's kind of this sacred nature to the name. And then that transitions to a sort of, and still like a tradition of caution. But that does is remove that caution. I mean, respect and caution, that's great. But it removes the point of the intimacy.
And so I've heard and read different times, like there seems to be etymologically a connection with the verb to be, like the existing one, the one who's always been. Does that hold water? Does that make sense? Or I don't.
Yeah, I think it does. Although, the closest we get to that is Exodus 3.
Yeah.
Where you have, I will be, it's the first person singular. I will be of haya, the verb, to be verb. I will be who I will be, is the way I would translate. Asher, and then say to them that will be with you. And then, of course, it's a vav in yod he, vav he. And the verb, it would be a yod he.
Yeah.
And Exodus 3 at least plays on the word to be, whether the origins of Yahweh's name has to do with like the God who is or something. That's hard. That's really hard to trace. Although vav and yod are commonly interchanged in the earliest, or not even just in early, but throughout biblical tradition.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Dusty, were you gonna chime in earlier?
Probably, but I don't know if I remember. But something that I was thinking about with the name of God is I recently taught a class, and we were talking about the idea of saying Adonai I was teaching the people about the Shema, and within that, the Jewish people will not say Yahweh, but they'll say Adonai, of course.
Right.
And so one of the things that I pointed out is that this is the tetragrammaton divine name, but they say Adonai, which translates to English as Lord. So in a sense, in the English, we have held to the same tradition.
Oh, for sure. Even
in a direct translation sense of it. Right?
Yeah. I think that's like the big point that people in our churches and even us personally, like when we're reading our English translations, you see Lord in all caps, you should know that that's the divine name. If you can just kind of do that extra step of reading, it goes a long way. And whether we say, I don't necessarily advocate for English translations of Yahweh as Yahweh, but wouldn't be opposed to it. But just knowing that Lord in all caps is the divine name, and always reminding ourselves of that is important.
Yeah.
In Genesis 35, I've got a lawnmower outside my window, by the way. Can you guys hear that? A little bit? Sorry. Okay, so good. Okay, good. In Genesis 35 and in most of the Jacob narratives, El is the name that God is going by. And of course, this story, Beit El, this is sort of the last time that we see it, right? So Jacob left at Beit El, and then he's come back to Bethel to sort of make good on his oath. In that first story, if you bring me back, then you'll be my God. You know, he kind of makes this deal. So it's looking back to that earlier story, but it's a lot of repetition too. It's like, well, he's already named that place, but he's naming it again. And Israel, we have Jacob being named Israel again in this story. Well, we've already had that story in chapter 32. We have a couple of different accounts of these kind of renamings. And one of the most fascinating conundrums here is where he names it El Beit El. Let's see, where is this? If we can find it again. So
Verse 7.
Verse 7. Yes, he built an altar there. Yeah, that's it. Yes, good. Thank you. So he built an altar there. He called the place El Beit El. So it's like, I mean, Beit El means house of God. Now we have God, house of God. It's like their name. This is almost like a divine name, the God of Bethel. But he's naming the place the God of Bethel. And we've had this, and then he anoints the stone, which we've seen him do before, right? When he has his dream, he anoints the stone that he's sleeping on. So it's just like stones appear again in Jacob's story. They're just all over the place in Jacob's story. You have two of them here. You have the the standing stone that marks the place where God spoke with him, where he anoints, or he anoints it, and with he pours over it this libation, and then he pours over it oil. So he anoints the stone. Then also combined with this, he is standing up a stone at Rachel's grave, another matzeva. Just seems like more of like a memorial marker than, I mean, they both are, but there's no kind of anointing of the stone in that case. You have that parallel, and also in this story, I'm just raising a bunch of issues here, but you have a parallel of burying the gods, and you have this story about burying Deborah right in the mix there. And it's sort of like the burying of Deborah, it's really cool. The story includes her, but it almost seems like out of nowhere. Oh, and she died, and she was buried under an oak. It's a different word for the tree or the idols. And I don't know what to make of that, except to say that, hey, there's kind of this narrative parallelism here between the gods being buried or hidden under the tree and Deborah being buried by the oaks. And we've seen these kind of significant trees throughout the narratives, even back to Abraham. He's hanging out by the oaks of Mamre, and then Mamre shows up again here. It's like bringing back a lot of themes that we've been seeing throughout the Genesis narratives.
Do you know why Deborah would have been with them and not with Rebecca? Like, is the
Yeah.
idea of being Rebecca's nurse, does that mean she takes care of Rebecca, or does that mean she's sort of like Rebecca's stand-in, so to speak?
I don't know. I mean, Rebecca, she would have nursed Jacob, I suppose, Jacob and Esau, or she
Yeah.
would, or at least cared for them. And
Almost
like
a
their,
grandmotherly figure, sort of.
yeah, that's the way I would understand it. We don't, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not remembering a place where we hear about Rebecca's death.
I don't remember.
So, but Isaac, all of a sudden, Isaac's still alive. Isaac was like dying back away so many chapters ago, or at least going blind and blessing and like passing on his blessing before the whole Padan Aram saga. So years and years before. Yeah, but I'm not sure. I mean, I bet people have written on Deborah, just like her character and how she kind of just shows up here again. It is no doubt significant that they tell us about her burial. We also have this little narrative stuck in here with so little explanation. It's like half of a verse in 22 that Reuben slept with Bilhah. And then the Hebrew only has, and Israel heard about it. That's all. I looked this up before, and the Greek adds, and it was basically evil before him, like that it was evil in his eyes, Jacob's eyes. So that it's like, because it's like lacking a little bit of interpretation. It's just, oh, we heard about it. But that's just kind of stuck in here. There's a couple of things, and that's the Deborah verse is right before that. So just to feel like tying up loose ends in some ways. Other observations or comments, questions, John?
I've never understood this. The name change for Jacob. When Abram became Abraham, there was a clean break. He was Abraham from then on. There was never any. But it seemed like this name change didn't really take. Looking at verse 22, while Israel lived in that land, I'm not sure that that's a reference to Jacob personally as so much as it is to his clan.
Yeah, which verse are you looking at?
22.
Oh, the one I was just reading.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. The sons of Jacob were 12. You get that there. But you're talking about the first part, 22. Yes. Israel. Yes. Yeah.
It seemed like he's for pretty much the rest of his life, he's still Jacob.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's some narrative. I mean, there's a narrator and a composer that's looking back and retelling these stories. And you're right that it does seem to flip-flop between the two, even later when they're talking about the tribe of Israel, they'll sometimes talk about, or the nation of Israel, they'll sometimes talk about that nation as Jacob, or sort of refer to it. So certainly this happens with his personal name. He really is kind of Jacob. And you're right about, that's a good point about Abraham. I mean, Avram to Abraham, they're so close. It really does seem like a name. Israel is pretty distinct from Yaakov. And name changes are significant. This story doesn't really tie the name change with any particular like wrestles with God, like what we had. It's just, you're going to be called, but it's a part of the blessing. So again, it's this is sort of the priestly storyline version of the name change.
I think, doesn't it say that Jacob will become Israel? Isn't that what the after the wrestling? He says he will. It seems like a future.
In chapter 32, I would have to look back if it's will become or if he names it. I mean, let's see if I can find it. It's at the end. No, it's not. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong chapter.
28, verse 28.
Verse 28.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, he said to him, "What's your name?" He said, "Jacob." That's 28. And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Not Jacob. Will," yeah, it is a future. "Will he be?" It will no longer be said that your name is Jacob, but rather Israel, because you've wrestled with God and with men and prevailed. So it's sort of, well, there is this kind of discontinuity here in some sense. No longer will it be said, but it will be. It will be said. I mean, it's an names are about identity, and it's and again, I would say that like 35 is one of those places where you can kind of go to see some of the story, the multiple layers of the story kind of being brought together, being edited together, so that we have a little bit of incongruity because there's different ways of kind of telling the story about Jacob getting renamed.
I'm sorry, we didn't get on earlier. We're in
no worries.
Moab, Utah,
Oh,
getting
wow.
our stuff out of the hotel room
Well, I'm honored that you're joining
on our
us
way to
from,
graduation.
from where you are in Utah. That's cool.
Moab.
Speaking of Moab,
So did
an
you
ancient
cover
place.
Rachel's dying?
Yeah.
It is. It is. It's looks pretty old here. Rocks do. Did you cover Rachel dying?
We didn't really talk much about it. We just
Okay, that, you know, Deborah's nurse dies, who probably was the expert, was despondent that Deborah dies. And in the Bible, as I understand it, the only ladies that die in childbirth are ones that have had something absolutely horrendous happen to them at first, like Eli's daughter-in-law when the ark is taken, and she names her baby Ichabod before she dies. The glory is departed from Israel. And so in Rachel, she calls him son of my sorrow.
Yeah.
It is said that it was a breech birth because they already knew he was a boy before he was born yet. So it could have been a placenta previa that she bled to death without someone like the nurse there to help her out. But the point is that, you know, all these little things, there's little things that mean big things. You know, she's going to mourn children in Bethlehem. They're going to mourn her passing.
Right. Yeah, Rachel, I'm glad you're bringing this up because there's a couple of really fascinating things. One, just Rachel's character is, I think, really important. I mean, right, she's and then also this is also the introduction of Benjamin and how she names him right after her own experience, but then that Jacob renames him something very positive, son of the right hand, right, Benjamin. But she names him as she's dying. She can see that she's dying, and obviously just her life is full of difficulty. On the one hand, she is the favored wife of Jacob, but she's struggled with bearing children all along, and struggled with her sister. We had that kind of line earlier on. Yeah, and her even to her death, she is kind of a woman who struggles. And it's a good insight too, that, like, it doesn't name who the midwife is or something. It could have been these others who are named.
She was gone, Deborah.
Yeah.
Deborah's nurse. Yeah. You wonder, how did she get away from Deborah to join them? But it sounds like they knew Rachel was going to have a baby, so she came, but she died.
Yeah, we did.
And Deborah is a generation older. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, we did talk about Deborah a little bit. Wondered why she was with Jacob's crew and not with, Isaac and so on. But we just don't know kind of the tradition, except that she is kind of Jacob's caretaker, evidently. So she is still involved in that, perhaps. Yeah, lots
Jacob's
of death and burial in this story.
Well,
go ahead, Betty.
That's the comment that Jacob says. I went all on my own back to Haran, but maybe he had other people around him, like Deborah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Clearly he did.
The insufficient narrator. Yeah.
Well, and that's just a general comment about biblical narrative. It tends to be, we get curious about details, and the narrator in biblical narrative seems to be, it lets the narration often come through the voice of the characters. So you sort of have to interpret what's happening, at least internally, on the basis of character speech. It doesn't give you insight into how people are feeling or thinking, but it's just sparse on details. Makes for fruitful or at least interesting conversations, but then what the narrator does tell us is especially important. Right, so it really stands out. Like, what I don't know what to make of. Okay, why did Jacob change his name? Right, no son of mine is going to be the son of mourning. Is that what it is? It was just but it's important. Not only because it's called Benjamin, but it's perhaps that's the main thing. The point was to say that for Rachel, she was son of my mourning. Yeah.
I think it was Robert Alter who mentioned in one of his things on biblical narrative that when God has something important to reveal, very often it comes out in dialogue or speech, he's put it in the mouth of somebody.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, paramount in Jesus. In these last days, he's spoken to us in his son. So I thought that's interesting. And another point he makes, I think, is usually the one who has the wisest thing to say tends to speak last. But that whole idea of, from let there be light through to the end of the Bible is amazing. How God, most of us would write down the facts, in sort of a factual list, but God is constantly saying things directly and profoundly through people whenever he wants it. He has it come out of somebody's mouth. The one that blows me away is when Jesus quotes in his temptation that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And then if you look at I wish they would translate the opening to the Sermon on the Mount properly, but there's a lot of participles in there. And then basically Jesus, he opens his mouth and starts teaching them, like
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. Just by way of
I've always
reference.
taken that opening of the mouth to be a reference to the placement of the voice in the forehead so that it projects out across the larger group. There's a difference between just speaking and speaking for a group of thousands to hear you. And I think that's the distinction there. When he was just talking to his disciples, he's just talking. But when he opens his mouth, he's projecting. And not only does the physics of that different, but the purpose of it, the way you interpret the speech, knowing that it's going out to a crowd of thousands who aren't necessarily believers, that changes how you interpret the speech when he opens his mouth to speak publicly.
Just way of reference, because I don't want to miss this, but if you haven't ever picked up Robert Alter's book on the art of biblical narrative, it's really worthwhile, and it really partners well with a lot of the kinds of things we talk about, like what we were with direct speech and so on. It's a good reference. His book on poetry is good too, but just since we're doing narrative, it's dialogue. And the other thing with dialogue is that, and I've said this before, it's like you can't always trust it because it's a character's word. So it could be trustworthy. It depends on whether you trust that character.
Yeah.
But whereas the narrator, you kind of have this, you usually give them the benefit of the doubt for being reliable as just kind of readers. It's dialogue. And that's one of the things that makes these patriarchal narratives so complex, is that we're reading people's dialogues and kind of reading into actions. Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, all right. Well, we're up. Our Hebrew story hour, anyway, is finished for today. So be on the lookout for updates on what's to come next. I'm still kind of thinking. So if you have, I take it if you're here every week, you wouldn't mind it keep going every week. But I'm just kind of rethinking about how best to continue Hebrew Story Hour in the future. I do have plans for it coming back. So if you're on Facebook, check out, look for announcements. I'll just say too, a friend contacted me this last week and asked if he would be stepping on my toes to do a Greek story hour. I thought, that's great. I mean, that would be great. So we'll see if that shows up. I hope it's beneficial. Beneficial. And the Greek would be great. So maybe if that comes up, I'll put up a little post about it on our group if you're interested in branching out from Hebrew or sticking with that. So,
I would love to hear the Joseph narratives. I think that would be absolutely awesome.
Yeah, well, the Joseph narratives are great. And actually, I'll just put in one last plug. For my first year Hebrew class, we read the Joseph narratives, like starting from the 4th class period, we're starting in on Joseph. So if you want to learn Hebrew or revisit Hebrew and read the Joseph narratives at the same time, let me know and I'll help you get registered. All right. Well, thank you all for your good attention and attendance and encouragement. And I'll hang out for a few minutes. I'll end the recording here. Adonai imachem.